So I'm Cynthia Millar, and I'm here performing this instrument, the ondes Martenot, with the Nashville Symphony. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about its history, which is now nearly 100 years old. The instrument was invented in the 1920s. Well, actually a little before that. It was patented in 1928. But Maurice Martenot, its inventor, had been a radio operator in the First War, and he'd become fascinated by the very pure sine wave sound, which was the sound of the radio of those days, a sound which on the instrument is called the onde sound. It's really a sound with no harmonics, and his original instrument produced this sound but over a very large range. The instrument has two methods of playing, and they're both quite confusing, so it's great to have an opportunity to talk a little more about them, because even from a short distance, it's quite hard to understand how the player actually performs on the instrument. So you can see I have a small keyboard. The notes are about the size of a clavichord note, but considerably narrower and shorter than a piano key. But the unusual thing is that when I depress a key, there's no sound at all, unlike a piano. All the sound on this instrument is actually produced with the left hand. And in this drawer, as well as having controls for my different sound colours and my range of speakers, I have this all-important key which actually makes the sound that the more I press, the louder the sound becomes. So I prepare a pitch and then produce it. The harder I press, the more sound I get, and all the different attacks are done with the left hand. So in a sense, the left hand is like a breath would be on a wind instrument, or the bow of a string player, and the right hand is the fingers or the fingerboard. Now, if the passage is fast, then obviously the keyboard makes the most sense as a way of playing. But what's really special about the ondes Martenot, and this is the sound that people are most familiar with, is the device which Martenot called the ruban, or ribbon. Now, in the original instruments, the thread here, which I may be able to make it easier for you to see if I lay it over the keys. This thread was actually a ribbon, a bit wider than this. But the significance of this is that because this thread is wound around a drum, which you don't see, I can make the pitch higher and lower simply by moving this ring which is attached to it. Now, again, the sound is made with the left hand on this raised wooden key, but depending on where my finger is, that's the pitch you hear. I can use this guide strip, which has no sound, but it's a more convenient place to play on. And I don't know if you can see, but there are indents which approximate the white notes on a keyboard, and the little metal studs approximate the black notes. But if I move my finger and the ruban at all, I'm going to make a vibrato just as a string player would. Now, of course, I can control not only the kind of vibrato I make, but also, as importantly, how I get from one note to the next. So if I want to make a rather a coarse glissando, which I'm quite often asked to do in this piece, I just retain the sound and just... But I could do something a bit more musical and maybe just take the beginning of a slide and the end of it, which then becomes really almost the way that a singer would sing. And I would say that of all the instruments that this is like, and of course, as you can already see, it's like quite a lot of other instruments, the thing that it most aspires to being is a voice with a gigantic range. So you can see that I've got 6 octaves. I can make that 6 octaves 7 because a switch under here switches the entire keyboard up an octave. So from having my central note here, if I switch this little switch here, it then becomes here. So at any point I can make a long slide of 6 octaves. And if I cheat somewhere halfway up, if everybody else is playing, I can actually make one of 7. So my lowest note is really quite low, and if I add some harmonics into that basic on sound, you get something much more sawtooth-like. I mean, that's actually a pitch you can hardly hear. And then at the opposite end, let's see, something... I mean, that's as wide as most people would ever want to go. So I've talked about the colours. They range, as I say, from the beautiful on sound to that very sawtooth sound. I can combine them, I can use them separately. And also, I have a range of speakers which alter the sound considerably too. The principal speakers, which here I've fanned out slightly, are in the tall cabinets. In the middle, I have an old style spring resonance, which if I used alone, you'd hear would just ring on, really. I have some control over the length or shortness of the springs. I mean, in other words, I can stretch them. And obviously, the more stretched they are, the longer they resonate. And of course, also that would depend on how much sound I send into that speaker. And then the really, really unusual one is out of sight, perhaps, behind me. And this was a speaker that Martenot called the métallique. And it's simply an orchestral gong with a drive mechanism which is attached through the gong. And it does indeed make a very beautiful metallic sound. I'll show you how it would be if I just ran up the ruban with it. Again, it rings for quite a long time, and you can tell that it almost picks out the pitches, particularly in the higher octaves. It's not a sound that I use very often on its own, because it isn't a large sound, but it makes a very beautiful blending sound with the other speakers. And there is one place in the Turangalîla-symphonie where Messiaen asks for it to be played completely on its own, and it always surprises people. If I happen to catch sight of anyone in the audience, I can always see them looking around, because the sound actually looks as if, or sounds as if it maybe ought to be coming from the percussion section, and I'll show you what I mean. It's very mysterious. It's just these very mysterious trills. You'd be hard-pressed to imagine that came out of a keyboard, electronic keyboard, or electrically powered keyboard instrument. So I think, what should I say about the piece? For me, as the player of this instrument, Messiaen asks me to use a great many of the sounds of the instrument. The instrument that I'm playing, which is an original on Martenot, would have sounded really identical to the instrument that would have been played when this piece was premiered in the 1940s. The ondes is asked at times to dominate the sound of the orchestra. It can play terrifically loudly, especially when I'm not using the métallique speaker or the resonance, if I'm just using my principal speakers. But it can also make the most beautiful, sweet, as I said before, vocal sounds. It blends it should be able to blend very beautifully with the strings. I play a lot with percussion. Oddly enough, the instrument I play least with, as far as actually physically playing the same notes, is the piano, which has this gigantic virtuosic solo part. There is one place, almost exactly in the middle of the piece, in the fifth of the 10 movements, where the piano and I actually play the same material. And it's very unexpected and rather a delight. But generally, the piano seems to represent the more percussive end of the spectrum, and the ondes, the more, in a sense, the freer between the notes material of the piece. And it's a colour that no other instrument has ever been able to reproduce, principally, in my opinion, because there is no other electrically powered instrument where the player has complete control over the pitch. And I mean, of course, there are many electronic keyboards which have a vibrato function, but the fact that I can alter my vibrato from note to note, let alone from day to day or from piece to piece, just as a string player would, makes it feel so fluid and so human, it seems to me.